You can't trust your tooltips. Final Fantasy XIV, despite how consistent and predictable the game is when it comes to a lot of design choices, fight mechanics, job designs and so on, is incredibly unreliable when it comes to how things actually work. From actions not actually doing the damage they say they do, to traits just not affecting certain actions, to buffs and debuffs not properly describing what they do or don't affect, to mechanics the game simply never addresses or explains. This inconsistency is so egregious that when it comes to accuracy and understanding, it is shockingly common that the only way you can be truly confident that an action works exactly as it says it does is if you actually tested it, which of course gets easier as you test and have more trustworthy things to refer back to. Alternatively, getting reliable information from others that did go and test also works, of course, and that is where I come in. I made a list! And be sure to share in the comments some inconsistencies you have found in the game. Now, let's get to it. Chapter 1. Healing. Maim and Mend is inconsistent. The classic caster trait shared between DPS mages and healers. A trait as simple as you do 30% more damage and healing surely can't be that complicated, can it? I can, thankfully, hopefully, inform you that the damage part of the trait is reliable, and as far as tests go, the healing part is too. For healers. When it comes to DPS mages though, increases HP restoration by 30%, quote unquote, appears to come with some asterisks. As it turns out, every mage heal added since Shadowbringers have been unaffected. Among the casters, black mages are of course entirely unaffected by this revelation, on account of simply not having any healing spells. Which also makes it a bit funny that their version still says it increases healing. I mention this because Summoner and Scholar also get a special version of the trait that mentions pets getting the boost. And speaking of pets, that's a whole nother can of worms we will get back to. What this means is that the only DPS mage healing actions that actually are affected by this impressive 30% HP restoration boost is Summoner's Physic, Lamau, and Red Mage's Vacure. This means Vacure's practical potency is closer to 455. This number is actually quite convenient for comparing between the heals that are not affected, as this makes Vacure only better than them if they are not affected by Maim and Mend, in some of the cases. Starting with Pictomancer's Star Prism. 400 cure potency. However, even with the exact same stat lines between the two jobs, the cure heals for more than 10% more than Star Prism, which indeed matches with the cure having an effective potency of 455, while Star Prism gets nothing. And then we have the summoner actions. Quick cards on the table here, the stat line between these two jobs for this test are very slightly different, with Summoner having roughly 0.5% more healing from Determination, and roughly 1.6% extra healing from Spell Speed. But let's just say that the number differences we're working with here are big enough. 30%, remember? That this is not going to cause any inaccuracy in the test. Starting with Lux Solaris with 500 cure potency. If Maim and Mend affected Lux Solaris, then it should at least be passing the 30k healing mark, which it doesn't. In fact, it heals for roughly 10% more than Vacure, which matches perfectly with 500 cure potency being about 10% more than 455. Next is Rekindle, which heals for just about the same as Star Prism, which matches with its 400 cure potency. The healing over time is also almost exactly half that, again matching with 200 potency. Which finally leads us to Everlasting Flight, which indeed not only does not get Maim and Mend, despite the tooltip saying it should even as a pet, but also contends with Summoner's pet potencies. We will get back to this later, making the healing even less, not even passing the 5k mark consistently. The important takeaway from this is simply that even something as simple as you do more healing isn't consistent or reliable necessarily. Cure potency against damage potency. For the math wizards here, it is worth leading with the fact that the calculation for cure potency and damage potency is slightly different. However, simply put, cure potency is roughly 20% less effective than damage potency, meaning that 500 cure potency is roughly equal to 400 damage potency. This is universally true and does stack with other oddities in the game. Notably, the fact that tank damage scaling also means that tanks simply do 20% less damage, roughly, per damage potency than other roles. Which is to say, for tanks specifically, their damage potencies actually are comparable to their cure potencies, because both things are 20% less than you'd normally expect. Now, on the cure potency versus damage potency thing, the best job to demonstrate this with, by far, is Sage. Diagnosis has a cure potency of 450, and Doses has a damage potency of 380. If one potency is one potency, then Diagnosis should easily heal for more than Doses does damage. However, if cure potency is in fact roughly 20% weaker than damage potency, then Doses will beat Diagnosis, which it does. To be fair, it's not exactly like there is much reason to compare cure potencies with damage potencies directly, but it does add to this feeling of inconsistency that, despite damage and healing scaling with either the same stat or two different stats that are always equal in the case of healers, they don't scale equally. Reducing healing received. Nearly every single, if not outright every single debuff in the PvE section of the game that reduces healing done or received, usually received, says it reduces healing received generally, or vaguely, but unless it sets healing to 0, it typically only applies to spells. A particular example of this is Ramuh Extreme, where grabbing more than 3 orbs applies a debuff that specifically reduces healing received, except only from spells. This means that healing from, say, the tank's own 1-2-3 combos or a healer's ability-based options will not be affected, and will still be fully functional. An example of the 0 case is Rathalos, where in Phase 2 you can only be healed by the potion item you're given, and indeed here, all healing is zeroed out. One more detail to this is that barriers are not considered healing themselves, so if an action applies a barrier based on cure potency, the barrier will apply just fine despite healing being zeroed out. Unless, like in the case of say Adloquium, the shield is based on the actual healing done. One last detail here is that there are several healer-exclusive buffs that increases the healing done by spells, increases healing magic potency, but anything that increases healing of everything is always increasing healing received. Funny, right? Something worth noting about both the potency thing and the healing received thing is that both of these mechanics may be weird due to ARR legacy stuff. In actual A Realm Reborn, the only jobs that actually had actions with actual cure potencies were healers, and every action with actual cure potency on them were spells, including Eos's Whispering Dawn. This matters because back then, a healer's attack magic potency and healing magic potency would differ as they scaled with different attributes, and healers made use of cleric stands to swap them to actually have a useful attack potency. As a result, it made sense for these things to be calculated differently, and maybe somehow, if the stats had been equal, they would have resulted in a 20% difference as we see now. It just wasn't visible until, say, Stormblood, when the stats became equal. On the reducing healing received part, any healing provided by a non-healer or by a healer through non-spell healing would scale off something else. Storm's Path was lifesteal as one example, Lustrate was max HP percent as another example. So it is possible this specific inconsistency originates from ARR. Speaking of lifesteal, this is more prominent in PvP, but lifesteal and otherwise percentage-based healing are entirely unaffected by healing increasing and decreasing effects unless it is this specific zeroing out case. This is because healing that scales off something else, quote-unquote, like this, completely scales off of that and typically ignores modifiers. Chapter 2. Pets Lamau. Pet Potencies. This one is a pretty well-known piece of jank, which simply boils down to pets have their own stat lines and scales with your gear, in a way. Except they don't get the party bonus, apparently. And because of how all these things scale, each job with a pet has a different pet potency, as it is commonly called, as a result of how strong the pet is in proportion to the user. I will preface this by saying it's really confusing to figure out these numbers, so these might be a bit dated. Do feel free to correct me in the comments. But let's take a little rundown of the jobs with pets. Summoner pets are about 84% as strong as the user, and 80% as strong if the summoner gets the full 5% party bonus. This means that spells like Summon Titan are closer to 640 potency despite being listed as 800. This also applies to all other summons, with perhaps the most notable one being Exodus, which states 1500 potency but is actually closer to 1200, before we count things like Maim and Mend and all that. The confusion in regards to pet potencies here emphasizes further, as at the launch of Dawntrail, the summoner trait Arcane Mastery didn't apply to any of the pet actions in the tooltip, even if it changed the appropriate tooltips to suggest it did. The similar Endwalker trait for Scholar boosting pet healing also stopped working at this time, which would be difficult to catch with the weird multipliers associated with pet potencies. Don't worry, both of these bugs have been fixed. Speaking of which, next in the order is Scholar and Machinist with 95% pet potency or 91% with party bonus. This means that, for example, Whispering Dawn is closer to 73 potency per tick and Embrace is closer to 164. Similarly, a full maximum battery Automaton Queen goes from 2660 potency down to 2421. There's also a whole different angle that Machinist has a trait that makes them do more damage, and I don't know if that applies to the Queen, but if that's the case, you can multiply an additional 5 6s on that, because they would be missing those 20% as well. But it isn't a colossal difference. But it is at least a whole arm punch just gone. Could be too with the increased action thing. Anyway, slightly higher is Ninja with 97% or 92% with party bonus. This applies to Bunshin and Phantom Kamaitachi, with the Phantom being closer to 644 potency despite listing as 700. The Bunshin single target hits also lose about 13 potency each. Nearing the end of the list, things get really weird, as White Mage is at 101% or 96 with party bonus for their Lilybell. Here, it barely matters, but it is a little funny that the Lilybell baseline is stronger than the White Mage. Then, Astrologian comes in swinging with 103% or 98 with party bonus, because Earthly Star is also considered a pet. We'll get back to Earthly Star, as there's more to it than just a pet potency. And then, the king of pet potencies is Dark Knight, with a whopping 122% or 116 with party bonus. The main reason for this wild difference, I believe, is simply that Living Shadow does not have the previously mentioned 20% less damage per potency that the Dark Knight has as a tank. Pets and buffs. Intuitively, you'd assume that for a pet to benefit from a buff, they would have had to be present when the buff was applied. You know, so that the pet also got the buff. However, that is not necessary at all, as pets scale real-time with the owner's buffs, meaning as long as the pet enters, does its thing, and leaves before the buff ends on the owner, the pet gets full value. Which then makes things extra confusing when some buffs just don't count, and some buffs can be visibly present on the pet, which is especially obvious on Scholar pets. Starting off, most damage-increasing raid buffs can be applied to Scholar pets, but since they don't attack, it doesn't really matter. But that does imply that other pets can also receive these buffs, but since they scale off their owner and not really themselves, except the points where they do, There is no point in them receiving the buffs in the first place. Confusing. Next, specifically Dark Knight's dark side does not apply to their Living Shadow, apparently. Which is a bit confusing because dark side itself is described as if it is a buff, but appears, of course, as a gauge element. It is possible the assumption is that Living Shadow always has the dark side buff, considering what they are. And finally, the weirdest one, in my opinion, is Fey Illumination. It increases spell healing done, and Embrace is a spell. However, when the Scholar pet uses it, the pet, first of all, does not gain the buff themselves, possibly because often pets don't receive damage reducing buffs. Additionally, the pet does not benefit from the effect even if the owner has the effect, just because. It's also not about it not hitting itself because it cannot receive Fey Illumination from a different pet either. So despite the tooltip saying it increases healing done from spells, well, it says it in the healing magic potency way, but still, and despite Embrace being a spell, it doesn't work due to reasons. Earthly Star, Lamau. A fine little bit about pet jank is Earthly Star. In addition to the weird pet potency on Earthly Star, the actual potency in the tooltip turns out to be inaccurate, with the true potencies on Earthly Star being roughly 41% greater than actually listed in the tooltip. The only thing important here is that it means you can't be sure a tooltip's listed potency is correct, unless it was tested to be correct. Chapter 3. Just weird tooltips. Placed AoEs. Placed and channeled AoEs are very rare in 14, but have some of the weirdest interactions. Let's start with the simpler ones. Machinist's Flamethrower and the channeled attacks Blue Mage has all have two common traits. The channel begins with hitting once immediately, followed by hitting every second of the channel. Neither of these properties are explained in the tooltip, you're just supposed to know that. Next, Astrologian's Collective Unconscious similarly instantly applies both a damage reduction effect and a healing effect, specifically to nearby players, so the healing one. Then, every dot tick, the healing effect is refreshed. Paladin's Passage of Arms carries these effects in an even weirder way. It instantly applies the damage reduction effect to players in the cone, it appears to refresh the effect on dot ticks, quote unquote, but as the buff itself has no duration, you wouldn't be able to tell by looking at it. The effect also lasts up to 5 seconds after you stop channeling, which is why you may sometimes see paladins flicking the channel for just a moment in anticipation of a raid wide. Just long enough to cover the attack. Leading us then to placed AoEs. What all placed AoEs have in common is that, without ever mentioning it in the tooltip, they hit once right when they're placed, and then hit once every dot tick, so roughly every 3 seconds. Additionally, any side effects of the placed AoE has an invisible duration of 5 seconds, similar to Passage of Arms. For Dark Knight's Salted Earth and Summoner's Slipstream, this mainly just means the attacks do one more tick than the tooltip would imply. For Ninja's Dotton, it also means the slow it applies would last a few more seconds than it implies. For White Mage's Asylum, not only does this mean that it heals for one more tick than expected, not only does it mean the healing increase lasts for a few more seconds than expected, but the initial heal when the ability is placed is also affected by the healing boost it provides. This means Asylum itself, while boasting a combined 800 cure potency, is actually closer to 990 potency, practically speaking. Again, before we consider all other multipliers like Maim and Mend, blah 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 blah. And finally, Scholar's Sacred Soil. It heals for one more tick than it suggests, and the barrier lasts for up to 5 more seconds than it says it does. This stands out even more because of the similarity of Sage. Keracholi ticks precisely 5 times and lasts exactly 15 seconds on account of not being placed. Yet, despite being intended to be the Sage equivalent to Sacred Soil heals 6 times and can last up to just shy of 20 seconds at best. And finally, just straight up incorrect tooltips. I often joke about certain tooltips that are slightly off, with the joke getting better the longer the mistake sticks around. Now, this last one I also pose a challenge to you, the viewer. What is the weirdest tooltip error you have seen in 14? It can be exclusive to your game language or not, doesn't matter, I want to hear it. Let me know in the comments. Now, here's a few I know of. PvP Doton's effect is that it does damage somewhat weirdly, just like the PvE version Lamau, but also reduces damage taken for the ninja while they stay in it. Except the tooltip implies the damage reduction comes from Salted Earth, the Dark Knight action, not Doton. Pictomancer's hammer combo does not explain that it gains damage from direct hit and crit rate boosting buffs, which is a mistake for two reasons. One is that every other action with auto-direct crits includes this explanation. Two is that this mistake is only in the English version of the tooltip. And the third one to list here is one I was made aware of by some of you. The German version of Death Flare still states that it ends Dreadworm trance on use. This used to be true back in Shadowbringers, but has not been the case since the rework in Endwalker. So, how confident do you feel in trusting 14 tooltips at face value now? I thought it was funny to go over some of these weird interactions in a package like this, just to highlight some of the weirdest jank altogether. Be sure to let me know some of the weird interactions you have seen in the game, in the comments, whether it be an inaccurate tooltip in any language, or a game mechanic itself being weird. I would love to know. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, the probably intuitive way skill speed and spell speed would affect dots and hots would be to decrease the time between ticks. This is not how it works in 14, where instead they increase the damage and healing per tick. Skill speed affects physical jobs, offensive actions, both GZDs and OGZDs. Spell speed affects magical jobs. Skill speed distinctly affects auto-attack damage, and spell speed distinctly affects all ability-based healing over time effects regardless of the job.